didn't know you were sitting in the room. How exciting is that to have your name evoked by one speaker and not even know that you're sitting there?
Well, Simon is a great influence and a great thinker, much more handsome than I am, so I request not to put his picture next to mine in the future. Well, thank you all for having me today, Jamie and Alice. Thank you very much for putting this amazing symposium together. So my name is Guy Golan, and I'm very lucky because I get to teach public diplomacy at Syracuse University, and I'm not sure how many professors can actually say I'm a professor of public diplomacy. We have one of those programs, so I'm very fortunate. Public diplomacy, highly interdisciplinary. Some folks think of it as part of international relations. Some people view it as PR, advertising, marketing. Others will talk about it in the terms of law these days. So it's a very highly interdisciplinary field with various definitions. As Simon noted, soft power is a key concept within public diplomacy, but again, I reiterate Simon's notion that soft power and public diplomacy are not the same thing, not at all. So let me just jump in to a definition that I sort of like. And this is the way I view public diplomacy in general. Public diplomacy are attempts by governments to establish relationships with foreign citizens with a specific purpose, and that is to gain support for their foreign policy. Foreign policy can be military, it can be economic, various, but ultimately public diplomacy has a purpose, and the purpose is foreign policy. I agree with Simon, public diplomacy is an instrument of international relations. So we hear often about soft power. I think any literature review, Emily, you and Craig did massive literature review. We hear soft power over and over and over. And soft power, Joseph Nye's concept that nations can attract people around the world not with a stick but with carrots, with the attractiveness of their culture, of their people, of their values and foreign policies. It's a major key concept. But I want to build upon it. Soft power and soft power programs have been, I think, at the focus of public diplomacy research over the last 20 years. We hear a lot about exchange programs. We hear a lot about cultural diplomacy, language, people to people. This sort of gave rise to what I call the fill-in-the-blank diplomacy. So we have soccer diplomacy, and food diplomacy, and then wine diplomacy, and music diplomacy, and all of those are tactics. But again, I ask, if these are tactics, what are the objectives that we're trying to fulfill at the foreign policy angle? The key argument of the chapter in my edited book with Sung-Hoon Yang and Dennis Kinsey is that those soft power programs are terrific. They're wonderful. Jamie, you mentioned they're viewed as the gold standard of public diplomacy. And yet, I argue, most people around the world will never participate in those exchange programs. They will never participate in those people-to-people exchanges or government-sponsored. They'll never go to a soccer game or read the books from the embassy library. Rather, most people around the world will learn about the world from the news media. And here's a place where I sort of disagree with Simon a little bit. The actual actions of nations will not always determine their image. There are many cases where a nation can do wonderful things and yet public opinion about that nation will be negative. A case in point is the Bush administration's fight against AIDS in Africa. So President George W. Bush spent more money than any other president in history fighting AIDS in Africa, and yet his approval ratings were not necessarily that high in that region. So if people don't really know about foreign policy, where do they learn about nations? Well, in some instances, they will learn about nations from the news media. Right, so here is my integrated public diplomacy model. And I do want to preface and say, this model does not apply to all nations in all contexts. Different nations will jump through different levels depending on the type of nation it is, core, peripheral, semi-peripheral, or the context that we're talking about. So this is not a one-size-fits-all model. But the basic argument of this model is straightforward. It's sort of like a ripoff of the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that, right? So if you're hungry, you're not going to do well in writing academic papers. We know that. Well, it's sort of the same with
which we could apply right now.
So it's sort of the same with the concept of international relationship building. And that is, if people read negative news about your nation, you will not be able to have a positive international reputation, and therefore you will not be able to engage in successful nation branding. And if you have a negative reputation, your engagement program, your relationship building programs are not likely to be successful. Now, let's jump into this and see what we're talking about. Mediated public diplomacy, we have some GW folks in the room, right? So the great Robert Andon, one of my academic heroes, talks about mediated public diplomacy. What is mediated public diplomacy all about? Well, in the original definitions, it's about the attempt of a government to shape how it's framed in foreign media, right? That's a traditional definition. So the United States really cares about how Al Jazeera speaks about it, therefore it will use various, right, paid, earned, shared and owned tactics to influence that coverage. But nowadays, I believe the mediated public diplomacy is wider, because it's not only about the attempts of governments to shape how they're discussed in foreign media, but rather the attempts of governments to shape how other nations are framed, covered, discussed in the international foreign media. So as we see the rise of mediated public diplomacy, what we see is the governments have taken this to the next level. And more nations these days are increasing budgets to not only try to shape how other nations speak about it, but create their own information distribution channels in multiple languages, right? So we have Al Jazeera from Qatar, and then Al Arabiya from Saudi Arabia in response almost. We have Russia Today, RT, Press TV, Deutsche Welle, BBC, BBG. We'll talk, Emily will probably talk about that eventually, right? And France 24 and various other nations. Of course, everybody's taken out to social media. So what is the great theoretical framework for the study of mediated public diplomacy? Agenda building, agenda setting, frame building. Here is a wonderful theoretical toolkit where we can study and learn how governments attempt to shape what other media outlets are talking about when they talk about them, and what attributes are linked to the nations and the issues. So for those of you in the room who are interested in third level agenda setting, very proper theoretical framework. So mediated public diplomacy is about framing. It's about agenda building and agenda setting. It's ultimately about the relationship between news coverage, the actors who shape this news, the dissemination of the news content in the form of intermedia agenda setting, and today the social mediators who serve a key function in the distribution of these frames.
Do I need to go back?
Yeah, go back please. So ultimately we care about a new paradigm almost, and that is, do we have communication wars between nations? Well, again, it depends, but one could argue that news media, if you're from the realist point of worldview in international relations, where once we counted tanks and atomic bombs, today we can count how many followers international broadcasters have on social media, or how many viewers they have, or how many distribution networks they have, and how much influence they have in shaping international debate over foreign affairs. And if you don't believe me, just think about the nation of Qatar, a small nation with an insignificant military force that is a major actor thanks to Al Jazeera, right? All right, so the argument of the model is that nations that are framed negatively in foreign media cannot really go on to engage in relationship building. Now remember, most nations around the world will never be covered by the mainstream news media in most nations around the world. We know that from international news coverage research, world system theory, the flow of news from core to peripheral nations, right? And a lot of nations Claudia mentioned will be mentioned only if there's a natural disaster or interesting human interest story, right? So if you're a small country that is not covered, or that your coverage is positive or neutral, you can probably engage in building a positive reputation through nation branding and so on. But if you're a nation that receives a lot of negative coverage, think about Mexico these days, right? With the drug wars, it's going to be more difficult to engage in nation branding and position Mexico as a place to drink Coronas and lay on the beach, right? So there's cognitive dissonance between the two concepts. All right, so go back, please. So what is nation branding? Jamie, your model speaks about nation branding, country reputation. Well, in my model, I sort of separated the two. Country reputation, and you alluded to the research by Sung Yang and some of his colleagues from Syracuse, really talks about how people think about nations, right? And nation branding looks at the active attempt by actors to differentiate. So for me, nation branding, or branding in general, is not about logos or slogans. It's about differentiation. When you think about Brazil, you think about fun, excitement, beaches, good times. When you think about France, you think about wine and romance and cheese. And when you think about Saudi Arabia or countries in the Middle East, you may have a different kind of images. The attempt to link attributes to nations with an attempt to differentiate in a positive manner is what nation branding, for me, is all about. When you're successful in nation branding, you may improve your nation's reputation. But you can only do that if the media coverage is neutral or positive. Right? Well, if you're at the point where most nations never get to, where you have positive reputation around the world, then you can really get to the next level of the model, which is, next slide please, the relational aspect of public diplomacy. When we talk about relationship, this is really the public relations perspective. We're talking about building mutually beneficial relationships between a government and people of another nation. This is the gold standard of public diplomacy. This is the ultimate attempt that everybody's trying to reach. And next slide, please. Oh, yeah. So the focus is really about this relationship. But I want to remind everybody that governments, in my perspective, are not in the business of being popular or having a lot of friends. That is not what governments do. And many people would disagree with me in the State Department. But I agree with Simon, governments are not in the business of being liked. Rather, it's really about getting support for foreign policy objectives, right? Think about Africa right now. The United States is trying to build relationships. President Obama just visited Kenya and Ethiopia last week. There is a big competition in Africa between China, Russia, and the United States. It's ultimately about gaining legitimacy to get foreign policy support for different aspects, whether it's a war on terrorism, or economic, or development, whatever it is, but ultimately it's about foreign policy objectives the governments want to reach over there. A few thoughts to the scholars in the room. I'm super excited by this symposium. I always tell my students, and I always encourage everybody to think about public diplomacy as a startup. Okay? So if Nicole and Eitan Gilboa and the early thinkers, right, or the Microsoft and the Yahoos, we are now the Amazon and the Googles. Okay? And each and every one of us has a distinct and unique role to play in this emerging startup. Let's continue and debate not only definitions of public diplomacy, but the implications of public diplomacy. I'm always going to ask everybody who does research in public diplomacy the same question. This is nice, but how do you link it directly to foreign policy objectives? You know, if we teach kids in Colombia how to play with robots, or we send a country and bluegrass band to Pakistan, what does that have to do with the direct foreign policy objective? I think that if we don't know how to answer this question, both practitioners and scholars are going to have a real difficulty in gaining legitimacy from not only policymakers and people who fund programs, but also from the public. And finally, we really need to support one another in our research. I really think that because we're a startup, and you know, this room has 30 people, it does not have 3,000 people yet. But one day, hopefully, we will get there, right? And it's really through mutual cooperation and being open-minded, then we can make great strides. So again, I joined Jamie and Alice and Simon in saying, look, my model is not the truth. It's an attempt to sort of understand the world, but I really hope that all of us together, we can debate and test and present alternative approaches and work together. So the final slide is plugging the book, and many of you, actually, Josephine was one of the editors of the book here. Thank you very much. My RA. We have the publicdiplomat.com where we sort of try to raise public interest in public diplomacy. I hope all of you will take a part of it, record podcasts with us, write blogs for us, send us content. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, via email, and thank you all for the time.